Disclaimer, this video is in fact spoiler free. Similar to my Euphoria video, if you want to go into Twin Peaks completely blind, feel free to not watch this because I will be showing footage from the show, and I know for some people that's already too much. That said, I'll leave you with a simple yes, it is worth the hype, and for the rest of you, enjoy the video. A few months ago I realized that somehow I had never talked about David Lynch on this channel in the 3 years that I've been making videos. And there's sort of a reason for that. For one, I think talking about David Lynch would entail trying to explain David Lynch, and I wanted to avoid being that guy at all costs. Not only would it come off as more pretentious than I'd want it to, but it defeats the purpose of why his work is so great, and nobody, certainly not me, should be explaining what he does to you. I'm also pretty confident that I wouldn't be able to properly explain him, which brings me into my second point that I just don't think I understand David Lynch entirely, nor does anyone besides Lynch himself. But after watching more of what he's done, specifically the small project of his that I'm going to talk about today, that is why I think it's time to make this video. Because I think David Lynch, more than any other filmmaker that personally comes to mind, is making some of the most interesting films possible. His work, more than most, lacks any clear answer or explanation. While all art is subjective, it feels like he's making the most subjective art imaginable. My point is that you can't deny he has a clear artistic vision that has been endlessly imitated and never replicated, and I think that's sick. And that artistic vision was put on display in the biggest way possible when he and Mark Frost created Twin Peaks, one of the most groundbreaking television shows of all time. Twin Peaks is about honestly who the hell knows, but the basic premise is that Laura Palmer, a high school beauty queen, is murdered, sending the town of Twin Peaks into chaos. Agent Dale Cooper enters the scene to investigate and catch the killer, but in the process finds some really crazy shit, and that's about as much as I feel comfortable sharing. People love this thing, and I finally watched it, and I can understand why. Do I understand all of it? Absolutely not, and that's not where I get my enjoyment out of it. And that's the magic of the show. As much as I would love to give you guys a deep analysis and explanation for what all of this means, I don't have it in me to figure it all out after a first watch. And you know what? Maybe I don't want to know all of it. Having seen it all, I feel comfortably full with everything I felt. But I love this show, and there's really no better way to get that feeling out of my system than through a nice little love letter of a video to convince others to check it out, and to give fans of the show something to soak themselves in to validate their feelings towards it. With all of that said, this is why Twin Peaks deserves the hype. The first season was great, but the pilot specifically was a cultural phenomenon at the time, and for good reason. Whereas most TV pilots both back then and now focus on establishing through direct introductions, Twin Peaks really feels a lot more atmospheric with how it introduces the world. I'll put it this way, most shows introduce themselves as if a host came out and said this is what you're gonna see, but Twin Peaks feels instead like a song where the pilot is laying down a bass line before the drums kicks in. Because Twin Peaks, when you break down its 3 parts, all feel like pieces of music that build and bring elements together in a way that's kind of musical. Which is why I wouldn't say the pilot follows the typical whodunit structure where a murder is established and the entire show is spent piecing together the killer. It trails off into some really strange directions that barely have anything to do with the murder, but leave the viewer intrigued and all fit under the same umbrella. I'd say Twin Peaks works well and hooks you in because of how much is going on and how tonally consistent it all somehow feels. It feels like a complete community. While one could argue the amount of characters and subplots actually hurts the show and makes it hard to focus on anything, that's actually part of the charm for me. It tosses all these really colorful characters at your face, which leads me into a side point already. I can't even tell you how good the characters in Twin Peaks are. This, in all honesty, might be the best part about the show. The beautiful thing about these people is that they're all so unique, nobody blends into each other, which is crazy because there are so many of them. Even each sheriff has their own unique flavor. Hawk, Andy, Truman, you throw Dale Cooper in there and it's a fucking party. We'll get to him in a second. The reason each character feels so unique and real is we spend so much time with them even when maybe whatever they're doing isn't crucial to the plot. So much of Twin Peaks is extremely tangential in that it will sit with a character doing close to nothing important for a good period of time. Sometimes that character doesn't even need to be in the show. For example, Dick shows up and he has so little to do with the actual issues going on, but because he's so weird, it's still fascinating to not only tie him into this world, but watch whatever he does. These tangents should be boring, but they're not. It's such an inviting show that you're not upset, you're just drawn into the lives of these people. Andy is somehow very predictable and very unpredictable at the same time. Major Briggs is indescribable. Lucy is ridiculous and somehow very relatable. I still can't tell if I love or hate Nadine. Big Ed is an absolute goof and I just want the best for him. But the best character of the entire series, and in all honesty I think any TV series I've ever seen, is Dale Cooper. I don't want to overreact here, but I think Agent Dale Cooper is the greatest protagonist in TV history. Keep in mind, I've seen maybe like 3 TV shows ever, but I seriously don't see it getting much better than this. For one, Coop's introduction is as perfect as it gets, as it introduces his quirk and determination all through a monologue so hilariously detailed you can only find something like this in Twin Peaks. Coop represents a type of agent that I have never seen in film or TV before, someone who appreciates and acknowledges the importance of instinct more than anyone else. Of course, he relies on the truth and the numbers, but so much of his approach is digging meaning from dreams, coincidence, nature, and weirdness. He's someone who has an insane amount of trust and love inside of him, and the show does a fantastic job at getting us to understand that. Because so much of what happens to Coop as the series progresses, referring to some of the darker moments in The Return, are never explicitly explained. To understand his arc is to feel it, not be told how he grows. Not only is that an incredibly ambitious feat for a show, but it's rare to find a character capable of carrying that weight. Kyle MacLachlan is so good at what he's doing that I can't see Cooper being played by anybody else, and knowing how well Kyle and Lynch click, it's unsurprising his performance is one of the best representations of Lynch's approach to art. And honestly, for as dark and as layered as Cooper is, he feels deeply human, and part of that works thanks to the humor. For how intense it gets, Twin Peaks is a funny-ass show. If you've watched interviews or seen any of his other films, you know Lynch has a very specific type of humor that Twin Peaks just nails. A great example happens where James breaks a pencil in the most dramatic way possible in the midst of a relatively intense moment in the show. And I say that's a great example because the humor serves the purpose of grounding the series, reminding the audience how human not only this world is, but the show itself can be, which is essential because the horror of this world can only truly be as effective as it is within the context of the normal. That's a very simple yet important trait that I'm gonna touch on some more, but for now, let's touch on part of Season 2. Man, people are always talking about how bad Season 2 gets, and you know what? They're right. There are like 6 episodes in here that absolutely blow ass and made watching the show feel more and more like a chore. It's not awful television, it just feels like all the wonderful things that make Twin Peaks unlike anything else got thrown out the door for a brief second there. But the rest of that season, if I'm being honest, it's better than Season 1. The first 7 episodes specifically are an amazing time. Because after Season 1, honestly after the pilot, you really have no clue where the show is going and you accept the unpredictable nature and let go of the straps just before the roller coaster drops. But the coaster keeps going and it builds tension and it keeps you on edge. Then it does something around episode 7 that is amazing and mind-blowing and also gives reason for why the next few episodes aren't great, but I'm gonna say it's worth it. Those first 7 episodes of Season 2 are really what turned Twin Peaks from being an interesting and fun time into a drug where I couldn't stop thinking about it throughout the day. And then once again, that lousy chunk that followed immediately helped me sober up. But then let's talk spoiler-free about the finale of Season 2, which is really the finale of this era of Twin Peaks. This is really the point of no return, but I mean, we did get some sort of a return. It's where all the fun stuff kind of moves to the back seat and the dreamy, dark stuff takes the wheel. After this, the world of Twin Peaks never really feels the same, and that's when the darkness really starts to settle in, which seems like a perfect time to jump into Fire Walk With Me is your next step in the Twin Peaks order for your first time at least. It's a 2-hour-long film on Laura Palmer before her death, and it's extremely depressing. In the first 2 seasons of Twin Peaks, and honestly Lynch's film Blue Velvet, the good of the world seems to be in the foreground working like a mask to cover the evils that lie beneath. But in Fire Walk With Me, it feels the other way around, where an innocence is established as already being covered by an intense darkness that feels inevitable. In his past work, Lynch argued for the beauty we have in place of the darkness, but here it feels like there isn't an ounce of light. There's no space to escape a world that feels built to destroy. It feels weird that the order of this experience goes middle, prequel, return, but after watching Fire Walk With Me, it makes total sense why the logical place to go after that Season 2 finale would be here. Because rather than saying everything that happens afterwards is like this because of that finale, it's saying no, it's always been like this. Something so much deeper and darker is at play here, and we're gonna soak you in it. Lynch is a master of giving the viewer a feeling as a means of telling a story. That's a lot of fun as a mystery, but once he dips his toes into something as horrific as Fire Walk With Me, that skill of his will leave you a bit paralyzed after finishing it. You think that's the last time you're gonna be paralyzed, and you think you have a grasp on things, until he hits you with The Return is the 18-hour-long movie, or series, or whatever you want to call it, that Lynch and Frost dropped on us 25 years after the release of Season 2. I will say I went into this thing completely blind with very little as far as expectations go, and I suggest you do the same. If you've never seen it and want to skip ahead, do your thing. I'm not going to talk about the specifics regarding the return for two reasons. One is obviously not to spoil any of it for newcomers who are still here for some reason. And two is that for those who have seen it, I really don't think I'm able to offer anything as far as analysis goes. The return is amazing, but there's no doubt it is a brutal 18 hours to get through. It is very confusing and at times a little boring. You'll go full episodes without having any idea what is happening, why anything is happening, why you're here, why they're here. I was immersed but never comfortable. It was exactly what it feels like to be in a dream that feels inescapable. At that point, the show is so far off the deep end and so committed that nothing is normal and nothing is ever gonna feel normal again, and that's just a really sad thing to come to terms with. But as the season wraps up, as pieces to this monster of a puzzle begin to kind of come together, you start to slowly understand what's going on. You feel maybe a little bit of hope. Things that were planted way earlier in the season are finally serving a purpose, and you're like, oh, that's why that was there. You start to think that this frustration of falling without a parachute through this mystery might just go away, that everything might just make a little bit more sense, and then part 18 happens and you just feel like jumping into Lake Michigan and saying, fuck it, whatever, who cares? Who cares? It's a grand finale that answers the most important questions of the series and leaves you just enough of them unanswered. It leaves you in the most memorable and unsettling way that it can, which is saying something for a world like this. For a show that just starts to feel a little like you can sense its next move, it puts you in a state you didn't even know existed. The mystery of Twin Peaks was never meant to be completely wrapped up and answered. That's an expectation that I don't think ruins your experience going into it, because the way this show manipulates you, it doesn't really matter what you believe going into it, you know? The more I think about Twin Peaks and dwell on it, because quite frankly, it's impossible not to think about it all the time at this point, the more I'm appreciative of how it so gently towed this line of never exposing a truth that is so frustratingly obvious throughout the series. That truth is whatever you want it to be, really. You could argue it's a series about love, a series about America, a series about history, science, a series about coffee, whatever. And the beautiful thing is that it is so abstract but so simultaneously cohesive that whatever you feel makes sense. That in itself is extremely beautiful to me. Sure, it drifts off into tangents where you really question why Nadine was ever in the show, but that's never what the show was ever about. The show is about capturing a feeling, a thought, an experience that only you can have and argue for. Something that plants itself in your mind and never really gives you an answer, which makes it immortal. If Lynch were to give us the answers to this mystery, then we'd have it solved and we'd maybe never think about it again, but instead, people are gonna die without knowing what happened. So what was my biggest takeaway? If I had to choose one theme within the show that I really can't stop thinking about, it's the love. Yes, Twin Peaks is dark and nightmarish. Sometimes it's so unsettling and glitched out, you don't really know if it's the show or your TV. I just want to say really quickly that at one point my Netflix started buffering and it took me 30 seconds to realize that it wasn't a part of the show. But for all its darkness, there is a lot of romance within the show. Not only between the high school kids, not only between Ed and Norma, but the love in every side of it. Coop's love for coffee and trees, Nadine's love for curtains. These connections, I'm sure, have some actual reasoning behind them. I'm sure there's a reason for every detail in the show, but it's the way David Lynch is able to exaggerate these obsessions and romances that feels unforgettable and irreplaceable. In most movies, TV shows, books, plays, and whatever, love is always followed with a reason. It always seems to serve a greater purpose or be the entire point of the story. But love isn't just a thing in a story, it exists because it has to. Humanity thrives on love, and most stories do their best to adapt to this necessity. But the love in Twin Peaks is different in that it's unnecessary. Sometimes it's obnoxious, sometimes you lose yourself in it, sometimes it's dangerous. It's something as mysterious as the central mystery of the show, and it's something that every character experiences in an intense way. But more importantly, it's something as scary as the central mystery, as far as how powerful it acts. Falling in love, no matter what that means to you, is a cycle and oftentimes pretty addicting. You can't stop it and you can't explain it, and a lot of the time, it doesn't really have an end. And that's scary, but it's also beautiful. It's the only thing we really have in life that's timeless, and it leaves you asking, what year is it? David Lynch is seriously one of the greatest artists of all time, and is the reason Twin Peaks is the emotional roller coaster that it is. Mark Frost did an amazing job with the show, and obviously it wouldn't be what it is without him, but Lynch saw the greater purpose of the show's existence and miraculously pulled it off. His lack of explanation for the meaning behind the story and all the little details is crucial to the way Twin Peaks functions, despite it being mostly a TV show. it certainly changed the way I look at all forms of art. While sure, I've always believed art to be completely subjective, Twin Peaks put that approach to the test and made something indescribably beautiful and haunting. Even though I spent 6 months just taking my time and plowing through this show, I didn't cry when it was over. I didn't feel relieved. I didn't have any immediate thoughts. As soon as the credits rolled, the fully formed seed that is Twin Peaks gently planted itself somewhere in my brain, and now it's time to watch it grow.